Let's go Dolphins! I think we may have just reached the point in the offseason where reality is starting to replace speculation. Because for months, Dolphins fans have been talking about potential breakout players, potential starters, potential roster surprises. But after mandatory minicamp, something has changed. For the first time this offseason, we're beginning to see who is actually building momentum inside the building and who may already be losing ground in the race for a roster spot. And trust me, some of the names being discussed right now are going to surprise a lot of fans. Because while certain players appear to be strengthening their position every single week, others who many people expected to make this team comfortably are suddenly facing much bigger questions than anyone anticipated. And that's what makes today's discussion so fascinating. The coaches have spoken. The media has seen multiple practices. The rookies have finally had opportunities to show what they can do. And now we're starting to get a glimpse of what the Dolphins' final roster could actually look like. But here's the part that should have every Dolphins fan paying attention. What if one of the biggest surprises of training camp isn't a player making a roster? What if it's a player getting left off it? Before we dive into all the details, make sure you've already hit that like button if you believe there are still future stars hiding somewhere on this Dolphins roster. And today I want to hear from the most optimistic Dolphins fans watching. Drop this comment below right now. Go Dolphins! The best is yet to come. Let's flood the comments section with positive energy as we get closer to training camp and the biggest roster battles of the offseason. Now, my personal opinion is simple. I love this stage of the year because competition starts exposing the truth. Hype can only take a player so far. Draft status can only take a player so far. Eventually, coaches start rewarding production, consistency, and reliability. And based on everything we're hearing after minicamp, there are several players quietly putting themselves in position to shock people when the final roster is announced. In fact, one projected roster cut in particular could leave Dolphins fans completely stunned if it actually happens. Let's get into it. Let's fill the comment section with positive energy as we get closer and closer to training camp. Now, my personal opinion is this. I absolutely love this stage of the offseason. Not because we have all the answers, but because competition is finally starting to reveal itself. Every year there are players nobody talks about in May who become major stories by August. Every year there are veterans who seem safe until suddenly they're fighting for a roster spot. And every year there are rookies who arrive with little attention and force everyone to take notice. Based on everything we've heard coming out of minicamp, I think the Dolphins have several players in all three categories. What immediately jumps out when looking at the latest roster projection is that some positions feel almost completely settled. Quarterback is one of them. At this stage, the projection only includes Malik Willis and Quinn Ewers on the initial 53-man roster. The belief is that a third quarterback could eventually land on the practice squad, but as things currently stand, those two appear to have separated themselves from the rest of the competition. And honestly, that shouldn't surprise many Dolphins fans. What becomes more interesting is what happens at some of the other positions. Take running back, for example. There appears to be very little uncertainty surrounding that group right now. Devon Achane, Jaylen Wright, Ollie Gordon. Those three names are viewed as the foundation of the Dolphins' rushing attack, and there seems to be strong confidence in what each player brings to the table. In fact, the discussion suggested that this trio could potentially rank among the strongest running back groups in football if everything develops the right way. But then we get to wide receiver. And this is where things become extremely interesting. Because if the current projections are accurate, there may already be some surprises developing. The projected group includes Kevin Coleman Jr., Chris Bell, Caleb Douglas, Jalen Tolbert, and Malik Washington. And perhaps the biggest shock of all is that Tua Tagovailoa is currently viewed as being on the outside looking in. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a player many fans expected to have a real opportunity to contribute. Yet based on the observations from minicamp, there are concerns. The report pointed toward the performances of Coleman, Tolbert, and Washington as some of the most impressive among the receivers during minicamp practices. Meanwhile, Bell's absence due to rehabilitation and Douglas dealing with injury complications limited what coaches and observers could fully evaluate. And that's one of the harsh realities of this time of year. Availability matters. Every missed practice becomes a missed opportunity. Every missed rep becomes an opportunity for someone else. That's why Kevin Coleman Jr.'s continued emergence is becoming such a fascinating storyline. The more these projections evolve, the more his name keeps appearing. And every time a rookie begins forcing his way into roster conversations this early, it's worth paying attention. Then there is the tight end room. And while there doesn't appear to be major drama there, the projected group remains notable. Greg Dulcich and Will Kaczmar are viewed as strong roster candidates, while Ben Sims and Sadiq Teru are also projected to make the team. The belief is that Miami may value developmental upside enough to continue investing roster space in younger talent. But perhaps one of the most encouraging parts of the entire projection concerns the offensive line. Because for the first time in quite a while, there appears to be genuine confidence in both the starters and the depth. 10 offensive linemen are projected to make the roster, partly because of injury concerns and partly because versatility is being valued heavily. The coaching staff appears determined to avoid situations where a single injury completely disrupts the offensive front. And that's smart, because if there's one lesson every NFL team learns eventually, it's this. You can never have enough offensive line depth. Never. The season is simply too long. Injuries happen. Unexpected situations happen. And teams that survive those moments usually have quality depth already in place. But as interesting as the offense is becoming, I think the most intriguing developments may actually be happening on the defensive side of the ball. When we shift our attention to the defense, that's where some of the most fascinating roster battles begin to emerge. Because unlike certain offensive positions that appear relatively settled, several defensive spots remain very much up for grabs. And that creates opportunity. A lot of opportunity. One of the strongest projections coming out of minicamp involves the interior defensive line. Kenneth Grant, Jordan Phillips, Zach Sealer. Those names appear firmly locked into major roles. But one player who continues generating attention is Jordan Phillips. According to the discussion, he has been one of the most impressive interior defenders on the roster throughout this portion of the offseason. The expectation is that he could become a major factor in the middle of Miami's defensive front. Another interesting name is Zeke Biggers. After reportedly dropping significant weight since the end of last season, there is growing curiosity about what his role could become moving forward. The belief is that his development may allow him to contribute in ways that weren't as realistic before. But there was also one defensive lineman who generated a completely different conversation. Renee Conga. And this is where things get complicated. Coming into minicamp, there was genuine excitement surrounding his pass rushing potential. His college production suggested a player capable of creating disruption. However, one observation stood out. During the practices, his name wasn't being mentioned nearly as much as some expected. That doesn't mean he won't make the team. It doesn't mean he's struggling. It simply means there are still questions that need to be answered once training camp and preseason games arrive. And honestly, that's why this stage of the offseason can be dangerous. Fans sometimes fall in love with projections. But projections change quickly. One strong training camp week can completely alter the depth chart. One preseason game can completely change a player's outlook. Then we get to the edge rushers. And this may be one of the deepest groups on the entire roster. The projection currently keeps 6 edge defenders, including Chop Robinson, Josiah Stewart, David Ohabo, Cameron Good, Trey Moore, and Quincy Riley. The feeling is that Miami has enough flexibility here to keep additional talent rather than risking losing developmental players.